Hey, today we are going to be talking about kinship, relatedness, which seems pretty basic. I just put up the word kinship there. And a long time ago, when I was into making animations on PowerPoints, I made this animation. And I don't know if it makes sense anymore, but I just want to do it because it took me a long time. There, which is to say, you start from these very apparently basic principles. I mean, what could be more basic than being born and being married and your brothers and sisters? It seems very straightforward, right? But the more we look into things, the more we look out at societies around the world and our own society through a different lens and cross-culturally, historically, things get a lot stranger than we once might have imagined. So there's my animation. A long time ago, I would say, Lavenda and Schultz say about the 1950s. Let's say the 1950s, about 70 years ago. So I told you in the last class that the early anthropologists, let's say in the 1910s and the 1920s, got very interested in the idea of kinship. And in part, this was because it was something you could send people around to do without knowing that much about other people. That is to say, if you were an explorer or a missionary or a soldier, you could give this person a piece of paper and they could go into another society and they could sit somebody down and they could just start pointing to people and say, okay, who's that? And who's that? And you could come up with terms that people used and they would try to figure out, okay, how are people related to each other? And then what do people call each other? And so then these people would be able to send those terms back to the anthropologists who'd be able to analyze this stuff. And so what, as Lavenda and Schultz tell us here, is that there are these universal human experiences without which our societies stop, right? So we all, well, let's start with nurturance. We all have to have some sort of nurturance or food, right? And we have to do that collectively. It's hard to do that all by yourself, especially if you're a kid, babies, right? And we all have to be born. And in order for people to be born, they have to mate. As we talked in the last class, that doesn't mean they won't be doing a bunch of other non-reproductive sex, but a society has to have a certain amount of mating to continue. And the early anthropologists, like we talked about in the last class, kind of assumed that this meant that there would be heteronormativity, that in some ways the natural relationship, the one that would lead to reproduction, was going to be the favored relationship, and that was the right, natural, God-given way to do things. So the idea was, okay, here are these universal experiences that should lead to the same basic ideas about kinship. And so if you think about it that way, then if a society has terms that we don't understand, we might say, well, either they don't understand biology or they're involved in some sort of weird kinship idea, or they're just, backwards and dumb about this stuff. And so there was an idea that you could kind of, in terms of the stages of civilization, you could try to rank societies. And we've talked about this before, that some societies had more or less of the correct ideas about kinship. And people started thinking all sorts of weird things based on how people had names. And in many societies, you might not use the term aunt or uncle. You might use a term that is equivalent to father, but in that generation. And so people would be like, what does this mean, that they don't know who their father is? What's going on here? And, it led to a bunch of I would guess people had got some silly ideas about how people didn't understand or should be ranked in terms of this. What we finally discovered, and I think that is this the main point of what we do in kinship now, is that kinship is something we do socially. There's, of course, we need to do this biological stuff. Not, you have to do that. You have to nurture yourself. You have to be born, etc. But what society is going to prioritize is going to be, as Lavenda and Schultz say, selective. We make choices about, are we going to emphasize the male line, the female line, both lines? Are we going to insist, as they say, that, lots of people mate and have children, but they might not be considered legitimate because they haven't come from what we then consider to be a legitimate relationship. And so what types of relationships are we going to prioritize? Human beings are marvelously, I would say, selective or marvelously varied in how they do this stuff. And there's a great passage in Lavenda and Schultz just on the word, this is on page 434, the North American kinship term aunt. Actually, let's stop there. Do you say aunt or aunt? Aunt? We're okay with that? How about you, Timur? What would you say? Huh?
It's in Russian.
It's in Russian. Well, actually, that brings up a good point about languages, which we might get into later, which is that, in different societies, they're going to have different ways of classifying these things. Since I'm not up on my Russian right now, I'm not going to quiz you on this right now. But what they say here is that the word aunt or aunt in English in our society can be related to a person in one of four different ways: father's sister, mother's brother's wife, or mother's brother's wife. And so it may entail something that we would consider a biological relationship, but it can also be somebody that is in no way biologically related to us. And in many different societies, those words will actually might be quite different based on whether it's the father's brother's wife or your father's sister. Those two people maybe have a very different relationship to you, and you would not want to subsume them under the term aunt or aunt. So this is something that, again, sometimes when we think of our own society and we think the words we use describe things that just are, until we unpack them a little bit and figure out that these things are not, they're not necessarily as automatic as we once assumed. Like I said, one of the things that anthropologists did in the early days was to give people pieces of paper, and then they would also try to construct these things that are called kinship charts. And so this is something that that you may see now from sites like Ancestry.com or genealogies. People get really into these in terms of trying to trace their ancestors and figure out whether they should be related to royalty or not. But anthropology was in some ways one of the main producers of these kinds of things, one of the primary the people who were most responsible for these kinds of things. Oh, I should say, that's what I forgot, the title of this slide. Anthropologists got so into kinship that by the 1950s, some people joked, probably not a funny joke to you, that it shouldn't be called anthropology, it should be called kinshipology. Because you'd come into class and that's all we'd do. We'd talk about the Mohawk kinship system. And it was thought that we could, by describing these different kinds of kinship systems, sort of get at something fundamentally different about these societies. And so in the old days, let's say in the 1950s, if I was teaching this class, you'd be swimming in kinship. That would be a lot of what you were doing. And you'd be doing a lot of these kinship charts. And in fact, in the old days, in the not too old days, I used to have you rip out sheets of paper and start making your own kinship chart, and then we'd start talking about it. In the new days, well, in the new days, here we are in our funny world. In the new days, I have this YouTube example of an anthropology professor who does make her students do these kinship charts, but she showed them how to do it. So we're just going to watch that because it's pretty fun.